Riot Grrrl was a musical and political movement that seemed to come out of nowhere in the early 90s, and then within just a few years, it seemed like it was gone again. Why did it show up so fast? And then what caused it to fade so quickly? Last time I explored some of the women who influenced punk's development, and went through some punk artists who had a tremendous influence on Riot Grrrl itself. But now we're moving on to the 90s, when Riot Grrrl arrived. The media became fascinated by it. Bands that weren't Riot Grrrl started being called Riot Grrrl. And loud, fast, angry music from women was suddenly everywhere. I'm starting with Riot Grrrl itself, and then we'll look at some of the other adjacent artists from the same era. And finally, we'll look at the recent wave of Riot Grrrl bands, and attempt to find out why this scene, or maybe it's more of an ethos, has come back to life with a vengeance. I'm Michael, and this is Eclecticism, a love letter to music. If you enjoy diving into musical rabbit holes and exploring the eclectic world of music, consider subscribing. This time around, I want to share perspectives other than just my own, so I've spoken with some modern Riot Grrrl and queercore artists. I'll be including some of what they had to say about Riot Grrrl and queercore's history and importance, about zine culture, and talking about some of their musical recommendations too. That said, a lot of this will still be me prattling on because I did a lot of research and damn it, I'm going to talk about it. I want to thank those who took the time to speak to me about this topic. Nico Mack from New York City band Bad Static, Emma, aka Lady Lychee from Brooklyn, Luciyan from the Bristol-based queercore band Creeping Embers, and Ebony Watts, a Riot Grrrl writer and visual artist who's been involved in several zines. And last thing before we start, I'd like to thank my Patreon members. On the Eclecticism Patreon, you get an ad-free experience, and all videos include extensive song samples that YouTube won't allow. So thank you to friend of the channel, Matt Sweeney.
How would you explain the history of Riot Grrrl? What are the key moments, and what's the most essential part of the story?
It's a really long story. Kathleen Hanna is one of the founding members of Bikini Kill and the Riot Grrrl movement. I think she wanted to be a poet, and she met one of her favorite writers, and she told her what she wanted to do, and she told her to start a band.
Kathleen Hanna took a bus to Seattle, Washington, with the goal of meeting her literary hero, Kathy Acker. Acker's novel, Blood and Guts in High School, was an inspiration to Hanna, and at the time she was hoping to be a writer and spoken word poet. There in Seattle, Hanna attended a workshop that Acker was running. During this workshop, Acker said something that would change the trajectory of Hanna's life. She said, if you want people to hear what you're doing, don't do spoken word. There's more of a community for musicians than for writers. You should be in a band. Kathleen lived in Olympia, Washington. Thanks to Evergreen College, a non-traditional liberal arts college where students can come up with their own programs of study, Olympia was a haven for creatives. It was the home of Chaos, a student-run independent radio station that acted as a bit of a tastemaker for the Olympia region. And in the last video, I talked a bit about how this station impacted the beginnings of Riot Grrrl. But Hanna's involvement in the music scene began with a band called Amy Carter, and she later formed a band called Viva Knievel. Her lyrics often dealt with the issues she experienced in her early life. She had a difficult and transient childhood. She'd grown up with a father who subjected her to multiple forms of abuse. Her mother had quietly introduced feminist texts to her, and as a child, Hanna was also aware that her mom was counseling victims of domestic abuse at a local church. This was kept completely a secret from her dad, who'd already thrown a tantrum after finding a copy of a feminist novel at their house. With the band Viva Knievel, Hanna was processing some of those traumatic experiences through her furious music. The band resonated with other women who'd gone through similar experiences, and in Hanna's memoir, she talks about spending time after shows acting as a counselor or therapist for the young women who connected with her music. This paralleled her other part-time work at a local domestic violence shelter, and alongside these activities, she was able to afford her tuition thanks to a job stripping. This experience gave her a very different perspective on sex work from a lot of feminists at the time, who would often assume all sex work was anti-feminist, regardless of the circumstances around it. Kathleen Hanna found out about a kindred soul through reading a copy of a zine called Jigsaw, and she contacted the writer, whose name was Toby VIAL. VIAL had written thoughtfully about the politics of girl bands, and this got the two of them talking more about music and feminism. Then, after Hanna returned from her tour with Viva Knievel, the two formed a band. And not long after that, they met Kathy Wilcox at a Babes in Toyland show. Toby VIAL asked if she knew how to play an instrument. Wilcox said no. VIAL asked if she wanted to play bass in their band anyway, and Wilcox said sure. And thus, Bikini Kill was formed. Why Bikini Kill? Another Olympia musician, Lois Maffio, had used the name at a one-off show. Maffio was a friend of Toby VIAL, and VIAL loved the name. It was partially the juxtaposition of the feminine with the violent, but there was more to it given the origin of the word bikini. This swimsuit style was named after Bikini Atoll. How do you say that word?
We are looking at how to pronounce these words as well as how to say more confusing vocabulary. Atoll. Stress on the first syllable.
This swimsuit style is named after Bikini Atoll, part of a chain of islands within the Marshall Islands, where the US had forcibly removed the native inhabitants in order to test bombs. Some of the nearby atolls were still inhabited during these test bombings, and the people there were dusted by the radiation. And some people were told it was safe to return to their homelands when radiation was still being dumped nearby. The members of Bikini Kill loved that the memorable name would also give them a chance to bring up this history that's often whitewashed in history books. The members of Bikini Kill had quite a way with words. They gave us the phrase girl power, which they first used in an issue of their Bikini Kill zine. Kathleen Hanna also inspired the title of one of the biggest rock songs ever when she spray painted the phrase "Kurt smells like Teen Spirit" on Kurt Cobain's wall. By the way, someone commented in the last video that I seem slightly obsessed with Kim Gordon. That got me thinking about how often Sonic Youth comes up in my videos, and some other bands, so I'd like to officially announce the Eclecticism drinking game. If you are going on an eclecticism binge and you want to play, you drink after I talk about any of the following of my oft-mentioned favorites: Sonic Youth, Kim Gordon, Thurston Moore, the US Nirvana or any members of that band, Kurt Cobain, Dave Grohl, Chris Novoselic, Melvins, or Black Flag. Play on your own, play with your friends, make good choices. It's 10 a.m. Another enduring line from Kathleen came about because they were tired of seeing aggressive men slam dancing and making the area close to the stage unsafe for women. They were also tired of seeing women around the perimeters of the show, holding the coats of their boyfriends who wanted to get rowdy in the pit. So Girls to the Front became a command Kathleen Hanna would deliver to audiences, trying to force them to make space for the women up close to the stage, where they wouldn't have to deal with aggressive or gropey guys.
They were getting punched in the face in mosh pits, and they wanted to create a safe space for women to experience this music because there wasn't any. So that's why the message Girls to the Front was such a huge and integral part of their band, because they wanted women to mosh themselves and be in the front and enjoy that and not have the risk of getting assaulted in the crowd.
Their self-titled debut EP kicks off a mission statement for Riot Grrrl, Double Dare Ya. Dare ya to do what you want, dare ya to be who you will. To me, the song feels like a call to stand up for yourself, to value who you actually are, and to not feel pressured into shrinking your expectations to fit others' expectations. The whole EP carries this message through, in songs raging against those who profit from patriarchy, songs confronting sexual abuse, and doing it all with blistering but hooky punk songs. I just realized that in this I kind of left out the Revolution Girl Style Now EP, which is also great. I slightly prefer the self-titled EP. A collection called The Singles are a good place to start too. This combines tracks from some non-album singles and EPs, including quite a few of their bangers like New Radio and Anti-Pleasure Dissertation. It also includes the track where Kathleen Hanna and Joan Jett, who was also featured in the last episode, were hanging out in the studio together and ended up sitting on the studio floor and playing a children's clapping game together. How did this moment come about? Well, Joan Jett came across a Bikini Kill tape and had gotten in touch with Kathleen. Jett produced a few Bikini Kill tracks, including a newer and more polished version of their song Rebel Girl, which has become the song Bikini Kill is most known for, specifically the version produced by Joan Jett. And this is definitely one of the most iconic tracks from all of Riot Grrrl, a song that sounds like it's going to be talking down about another girl based on the tone and the first few lines of the songs, but then it turns out to be a declaration of friendship, love, and a little lust too. For better or worse, Bikini Kill would become the biggest band in the Riot Grrrl movement, with Kathleen Hanna being often treated like a spokesperson, despite her insistence that Riot Grrrl didn't have a leader. But the second band to capture the essence of Riot Grrrl was to come along shortly after Bikini Kill. Allison Wolfe and Molly Newman lived in rooms next to each other at University of Oregon in 1989. They met and bonded around their shared love of local DIY bands, Beat Happening in particular. They became friends with Kathleen Hanna, still in Viva Knievel at this time, and also with Toby VIAL. VIAL encouraged them to start a zine or a band, and it didn't take much encouragement before they decided to. Through their connection with Hanna and VIAL, they met many of their other idols, including Calvin Johnson from Beat Happening, Bruce Pavitt, one of the owners of Sub Pop, and Kurt Cobain. Oh, shit. And Kurt Cobain, who wasn't well known yet, but was also a part of the Olympia scene in this era. The band name came before any music, or before they even started learning their instruments. They knew they had a killer name though, and that was all they had for quite a while, despite referring to themselves as a band. Allison Wolfe said, "We were a fake band, we were all talk." Then Calvin Johnson called their bluff and wanted them to play at a Valentine's Day show, alongside Bikini Kill and Some Velvet Sidewalk. They went to musician friend Robert Christie and asked him for advice, and then they did the opposite of that advice. He suggested they listen to some Ramones records and that would help them to figure out how to be a punk band, but they decided if that was what most bands would do, they'd avoid hearing any Ramones. And their first show was very rough, but was greeted with enthusiasm by the audience. According to what everyone has said, this was a very inviting scene that was very open to people basically learning to play on stage. And that's one of the things that helped a lot of these bands to succeed even when they were coming into it very new to the art. This was around the time when Bikini Kill was a new band. Molly said, "They were so fierce and we were so dorky." And I think that was helpful in some sort of accessibility. Riot Grrrl was a scene that embraced the idea that anyone could contribute, and everyone should have a voice, whether it was through writing and putting out zines, or whether it was making music. After this first show, they were approached to record a track for an upcoming compilation with the title Kill Rock Stars. This would be the inaugural release for an indie label with a really impressive roster. And this 1991 comp is a wonderful snapshot of some of the great DIY bands who were either Riot Grrrl or adjacent to that scene, friends of these artists, bands they would tour with. In 1991, Wolfe and Newman traveled from Washington State to Washington, D.C. for the summer. Through some of their musical scene connections in Olympia, they had an inroad to meet some of the punk scene's bigger figures in D.C., including members of Nation of Ulysses and Ian MacKaye. Some of D.C.'s bands, who were already quite politically conscious, immediately embraced this new movement of these Riot Grrrl bands. We've talked about the memorable turns of phrase coined by Bikini Kill, but the actual term Riot Grrrl came from a less obvious source. Jen Smith was involved in the DC scene, and she'd watched riots in the Mount Pleasant area after a Salvadorian immigrant was shot by a cop. Watching the events of these riots unfold, while reflecting on recent laws restricting the rights of women in the US, put the phrase "girl riot" in her head. Later on, she wrote a letter to Allison Wolfe, who was back in Washington State now, and she used that phrase, saying what they needed now was a girl riot. When Allison, Kathleen, and a bunch of others collaborated on a new zine that could be passed out at shows to spread the word about this new scene, they went with the name Riot Grrrl, pulling in the growled spelling of girl with 3 R's. This was originally a bit of a joke, playing off the numerous varied spellings of the word women used by feminists at the time. And the term Riot Grrrl was come up with collaboratively, which seems appropriate for this scene. And to me, it's interesting that this is also one of those rare times where the artists in the scene actually chose what the media would end up calling them. If only the media had also understood the motives behind the movement, this story would have a happier ending, but we'll get there. Bikini Kill toured with Nation of Ulysses in 1991, and their final show was in DC. This show, in a place Bikini Kill was playing for the first time, became a legendary gig for the city's punk scene, and Bikini Kill would end up making DC their musical base, connecting to the local, already politically charged punk community. Bratmobile, after spending some time in DC as well, would return to Olympia. The first Bratmobile album, Potty Mouth, is one of the essential Riot Grrrl albums in my view. It's rough around the edges and feels a bit more ramshackle than a lot of what Bikini Kill has done. The lyrics are biting and often funny, brutal and shocking too, like in one of their early fan favorites, Stab, which has a disturbing chorus you won't forget once you've heard it. Cool Schmool is another of their best known tracks, which captures their attitude and the broader goal of acceptance in Riot Grrrl. They mock the idea of coolness, the superficiality they saw in some of the people around them, specifically calling out people talking about their looks, what they were wearing, but not actually opening up about anything deeper than that. This album also includes a blisteringly quick and sarcastic sounding take on the Runaways track Cherry Bomb. If you're exploring Riot Grrrl for the first time, this is an album you really need to hear. And I'm just as big a fan of their second album, which they made after reforming later on. Ladies, Women, and Girls came out in 2000 and is one of the later really strong albums from the original Riot Grrrls. So zines have been a part of punk culture practically since day one, and they were a vital element of what made Riot Grrrl special. So we're going to hear from some of today's Riot Grrrls and a queercore member about what makes zines so important to these movements.
But we have little zines that our bass player draws up. There's one that I've drawn up as well, but I've not printed any of those off yet. I see zines mostly in DIY spaces, so again that coincides quite a lot with queer spaces and disabled spaces, and also spaces for ethnic minorities too.
I saw this ad on Tumblr for a zine called the Pulp Zine, and they were looking for collage artists, like digital collage work for them for a little while. So I started write things for them, like interview artists and like just talk about like what like feminism means to us. I had a lot of unchecked confidence when I was a teenager, so a lot of the writing I don't think is that good, but it still got out there somehow.
Is there an element of nostalgia to it, or is there an element mostly of just practicality of like it's still cheap to put together?
I think it is a combination of nostalgia, versatility, and affordability, because anyone can get some paper and a pen. Anyone can make a zine about something that they care about and make some photocopies and hand them out or leave them at a venue. A lot of people that are in the queer and disabled communities are also in poverty and are poor and don't have tons of money to spend on merch and things like that. Zines being affordable, accessible, and something that a lot of people can afford to give away for like quite cheap is absolutely great for the reach of what is in these zines.
I saw ones the other day that were all about ice and how to deal with those interactions, and that's just a free resource that you get. The reason they were so popular is just because it was really easy to create and to share out and to exchange. That was a big part of it. People would exchange zines with each other and share their ideas and thoughts, and people were interested and wanted to read that. You know, they didn't have the internet. They didn't have this public forum. Like, zines were that public forum.
If I hadn't found any of that information, I don't think I would have, like, had self-confidence. I think that's really what was really important to me. This is a way for women to be confident about themselves.
The Riot Grrrls and the queercore scene both had politically charged messages that didn't fit with the mainstream press. So zines became a vital part of Riot Grrrl's identity. The idea was for everyone to be involved in some way. And as we'll see throughout this video, a lot of bands started because their friends just said, you should make a zine or start a band or both. Bratmobile had their zine, and Bikini Kill's members were involved in multiple zines. And for many outside of Riot Grrrl's epicenters of Olympia and Washington, D.C., contributing a zine and sending it out to other Riot Grrrls was the easiest way to get involved in the community. So the Patreon version has a lengthy digression on the whole history of zines, so if you're the kind of person who likes reading the footnotes, make sure to subscribe to the Patreon for a mere $5 a month to get every digression, music sample, and radio show that I put together. Alongside music and zines, it's probably no surprise that activism and community building was a vital part of the scene as well. Kathleen Hanna connected with a DC activist group called the Positive Force, and used their building for an all-girl meetup, which retroactively became known as the first Riot Grrrl meeting. It was presented as a chance to discuss how to get more women involved in the punk community, but it became more than that. It was a safe space for many young women, an opportunity to open up about things like abuse, sexism, and politics. And the Riot Grrrl meetups and events would end up being an important part of what built the Riot Grrrl community.
So it was like a really beautiful space for other women to meet each other and be vulnerable, but also just be friendly and have fun talking about the things that they love.
This community was great for some, but it was by no means perfect. And by the admission of Hannah and others later on, the group let down some people who were looking for community. One early attendee stopped coming because, in her words, it wasn't gay enough. And many of the young white women didn't recognize the additional challenges faced by people of color who attended the meetings. It was certainly imperfect, but it's worth remembering that this was put together by women who were barely out of their teens, some of them still in their teens, and they were trying to fill a social need that wasn't being addressed by the broader society. So I personally find it very hard to dismiss what they were able to do, even if it did have some blind spots. The DC and Olympia scenes remained in close contact, with Bratmobile traveling between the two cities, at one point with different lineups in each, but eventually settling on a trio of members. And as the Riot Grrrl scene grew, some other bands grew up with it. Heavens to Betsy, an Olympia-based band, was another fake band at first. Corin Tucker and Tracy Sawyer talked about being in a band way before ever practicing, and they were finally forced into action when they were invited to perform at an event. Corin Tucker, on vocals and guitar, had a harsh and powerful voice that's pretty unmistakable. Tracy Sawyer was on drums. They toured with Bratmobile early on, and they were close with that band. They've talked about how embraced they felt by the whole scene, actually. Without having any idea how to produce music, and without any money being exchanged, Newman was actually hanging out with them when their first EP was recorded, and they can't quite remember if she was actually involved in producing or if she was just there. But again, they had help recording their songs without having to pay for studio space. And the EP, These Monsters Are Real, was released on Kill Rock Stars in 1993. Their final release was Calculated, and this was their only full-length album. This is another of what I see as the core albums from the original Riot Grrrl scene, with Corin Tucker's huge, almost violent vocal delivery matching the heavy song topics. The music's also heavier than their earlier recordings, the tone having evolved a little towards the tone of grunge. There's still a bit of the lo-fi vibe and the blown-out vocals that you'd find on Bikini Kill or Bratmobile's early releases. There were 2 Heavens to Betsy tours, the first with Bratmobile, and the second with a band called Excuse 17. Excuse 17 was an Olympia trio that featured Carrie Brownstein on guitar and vocals, and the meeting of these 2 bands would lead to great things. Excuse 17 was a short-lived band, but in the short time they recorded 2 albums, Excuse 17 and Such Friends Are Dangerous. These have more of a fuzzy indie rock sound than a lot of the Riot Grrrl bands. There's still an aggressive edge, but it's tempered a bit compared to the other bands we've covered so far. I enjoy both those albums, and I particularly recommend their self-titled first album. But the meeting of Corin Tucker and Carrie Brownstein would be pivotal. The 2 would end up forming a band together in 1994, Sleater-Kinney. And I wouldn't call Sleater-Kinney strictly Riot Grrrl, since they formed late in Riot Grrrl's story, and they go on to be very well produced and even electronic at some points in their career. They would go from being associated with Riot Grrrl with their first album to making some of the most acclaimed rock albums of the next decade. If you're new to them, they've put out enough music now that they might have a little bit intimidating of a catalog. You can always just start at the beginning, obviously, and work your way through, but here are my top 3. Their third album, Dig Me Out, maintains a lot of the punk from their earlier releases, with some very strong songs to back it up. And their new drummer at the time, Janet Weiss, gave them a more powerful and complementary rhythm section than what they'd had up to that point. Then their fourth album, The Hot Rock, pivots a bit further away from punk, but it shows some of the tightest interplay between Tucker and Brownstein's vocals and guitars. This was the band in peak form, and it's become my very favorite. But very close is their seventh album, The Woods, which embraces more feedback and more of a hard edge, with some of their very best songwriting in my opinion.
I think a big distinction was a lot of women musicians didn't want to be considered women musicians. They wanted to be considered musicians. And I think Riot Grrrl was like, we're women musicians. Like, this is about feminism. This is about this movement. And I think there was a big line where people are like, I just want to be taken seriously.
From before Riot Grrrl started, and throughout the scene, there were some excellent bands who were also concerned with the issues around women's rights, and who were also feminist, but who are ambivalent to the movement itself and never claimed to be Riot Grrrl. So I'm going to spend a little less time on each of them than the main Riot Grrrl bands, but I do think it's worth talking about them in this video, since this was all going on at the same time and with the same political backdrop. Also, I think if you enjoy the Riot Grrrl bands, you're likely to enjoy a lot of these bands too. L7 started in '85, and they'd never meant to be an all-girl band, it just kind of evolved that way. The guy members of the band kept not quite fitting, and once they settled into a lineup that was firing on all cylinders, they happened to be all women. They refer to their music as meat and potatoes rock. With a couple big hits, like Pretend That We're Dead, they had some success on the charts, but were maybe a bit too wild to stay in the mainstream for very long. For example, during their set at the Reading Festival in '92, Danita Sparks responded to the particularly hostile crowd by shouting, "Eat my used tampon, fuckers," and then pulling out her tampon and throwing it into the crowd. But alongside their wild behavior, they were a politically active band. They founded Rock for Choice, a series of benefit concerts in support of abortion rights that continued until 2001. Bricks Are Heavy is the release that gets the most attention. Honestly, I prefer the releases before and after this one. Smell the Magic is a bit rougher around the edges, without the shinier production of Bricks, which was produced by Butch Vig, the same guy who produced Nevermind and Siamese Dream. On the follow-up to Bricks Are Heavy, Hungry for Stink, They made an effort to bring back that harsher edge to their sound. And it also has my favorite L7 song, Fuel My Fire, which got a really good cover on the Prodigy's album The Fat of the Land, actually. Then the Gits. Formed in Seattle in '86, the Gits were led by Mia Zapata, a powerful and emotive vocalist and lyric writer. They often get lumped in with grunge because of where they were from, but their music was definitely punk. Their debut, Frenching the Bully, is highly underrated punk with consistently good lyrics. So is its posthumous follow-up, Enter the Conquering Chicken. It was posthumous because in 1993, Mia Zapata was sexually assaulted and murdered after leaving a show. This shook the music community, and not just the Seattle scene. Benefits raised a lot of money to find her murderer, with artists like Joan Jett, Heart, who I really should have mentioned at some point in the series, Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and many others involved in helping to raise money. They were a great band with a career that was cut way too short. Before L7, the band's bassist, Jennifer Finch, had been in a short-lived band called Sugar Baby Doll, and this band included Kat Bjelland on lead guitar and Courtney Love on lead vocals. This band included musicians who would end up in L7, Babes in Toyland, Hole, and a guitarist who would end up with a pretty consistent and eclectic career, touring with all sorts of artists, including Pink. Kat Bjelland would go on to form Babes in Toyland, and their sound includes more metal than a lot of the bands we're covering. You can hear some shared influences between this band and Hole, a bit of Rightwig mixed into both of those bands' DNA. I like everything they've put out, but their first two albums are the highest points for me, Spanking Machine and Fontanelle. Then the Lunachicks. Lunachicks were a New York City punk band who formed in '87, and they were a bit closer to the skate punk scene than to the politically conscious scenes of DC or Olympia. They were actually inspired by everything from metal to hard rock, but they started with so little musical experience that making punk music was kind of inevitable, and as they learned and improved, they stuck to that punk scene that was embracing them. Their lyrics are less focused on feminism specifically than a lot of the bands we're covering, but for their feral music and their DIY spirit, they seem like a good fit here anyway. I find them very consistent, with Babysitters on Acid being a bit fuzzy and dirty in its production, and then Jerk of All Trades and Luxury Problems showed the band with a more cleanly produced sound, the vocals more forward and prominent in the mix. Unusually for me, I think I like Lunachicks more in their later and better produced years, possibly because I feel like their songwriting also improved as they went along. And then Hole. Have you heard of Hole? This isn't a deep cut, but obviously it's a relevant one. Hole formed in '89 after Courtney Love's very strange stint in Faith No More. Pretty on the Inside is fucking awesome, with a raspy vocal delivery a perfect fit for the furious anger of these ugly and angry songs. This one was produced by Kim Gordon, who Courtney Love sought out because she appreciated the production sound of early Sonic Youth albums like Evil and Sister. Here we go again. And then Hole delivered the goddamn masterpiece, Live Through This. And this should need no introduction. It really should get as much attention as any of the 90s rock classics, I think. This shows a masterly range with songs like Violet that are reminiscent of their earlier, punkier music, alongside some incredibly catchy songs like Plump and Rockstar. Love has a really powerful growl, but you can also hear the pain in her delivery on some of the softer songs here, like Asking For It, and of course Doll Parts. Because of Courtney Love's treatment in the press, their music is often overshadowed, but this album is a classic. And I'm not saying Courtney Love is perfect or a nice person. She punched Kathleen Hanna in the face, and she has some other really questionable moments. But when male musicians are complete douchebags, the press is way quicker to forgive them than they ever were for Courtney Love. And then 7 Year Bitch. 7 Year Bitch formed in 1990 in Seattle, with their first gig opening up for the Gits. These two bands were close friends, and both of them faced tragedies throughout their short careers. 7 Year Bitch's co-founder and guitarist Stephanie Sargent died in 1992 of complications from a heroin overdose. She was one of the Seattle scene's many losses from that drug. Viva Zapata, 7 Year Bitch's second album, was dedicated to both Zapata and Sargent, who'd both passed fairly recently. I recommend starting with this one, but I also really like Sikkim. And then for extra credit, explore the career of Christina Bilot. I think that's how you say her last name. She was in a mostly forgotten band called Autoclave that only made one EP while they were around, but their tracks have been compiled on a self-titled comp years later. And it's really good stuff. Bilot would be drummer for Bratmobile DC during that brief era when Bratmobile had 2 lineups, and later she'd be a founding member of Slant 6. This was another short-lived band, but they made 2 really good albums in that short time. And Soda Pop Ripoff is my favorite of the 2. She's later been in Casual Dots with Kathy Wilcox of Bikini Kill, who formed in 2002, and they just released another album a few years ago. And while we're on the subject of Bikini Kill side projects, the Frumpies were a bit of a supergroup, with members of Bikini Kill and Bratmobile. The compilation of their songs called Frumpy One Piece is what I'd recommend checking out from them. And then lastly, Jack Off Jill. They started during the Riot Grrrl era, and they were involved in some Riot Grrrl tours and benefit shows, but their recording career started a little bit later. Their second and last album is the one I'd recommend starting with, Clear Hearts, Gray Flowers. So that was me trying to cover a lot of bases. I'm sure I still left out some important bands. If you think I've missed out on someone important, please leave a comment. Talk about who I left out and why you like them. But now let's get back to the actual Riot Grrrl story, and what happened to this scene. Well, the media got a hold of it, and that was the beginning of the end. Reporters started getting in touch. Photographers started showing up, uninvited, getting photos for papers. USA Today published an article that portrayed the scene in an insulting light. They included quotes from the Riot Grrrl meetings that were supposed to be confidential. They described the typical Riot Grrrl fashion, unshaven armpits and legs, Doc Martens, fishnets, and treated the magic marker stomach writing of words like rape as if they were just a part of the fashion. This was actually a method of confrontation that went back to Kathleen Hanna writing the word slut across her stomach at an earlier show, aware that some men in the audience would be ogling her body, while also judging her for having any of it exposed. It was a choice to confront the audience with the word they were likely to thrust upon her anyway. And this did become a practice within Riot Grrrl, with confrontational magic markered words on stomachs and other writing and drawings on the body. But the USA Today article reduced it to a quirky fad, devoid of any of the context. And in microcosm, that's what the media did with the whole movement. Spin, for example, ended up publishing an article on Riot Grrrl with 0 photos of actual Riot Grrrls, but instead with photos of a skinny, topless model with the words Riot Grrrl written on her arm and bitch written on her forehead. Corin Tucker said, "I think it was deliberate that we were made to look like we were just ridiculous girls parading around in our underwear. They refused to do serious interviews with us. They misprinted what we had to say. They would take our articles and our fanzines and our essays and take them out of context. We wrote a lot about sexual abuse and sexual assault for teenagers and young women. I think those are really important concepts that the media never addressed." To use current parlance, they treated Riot Grrrl as something performative, not considering why this movement suddenly evolved at the time when it did. This was the early 90s, when in the United States, the Republicans were more blatantly beginning to collaborate with fundamentalist Christian groups on crafting their policy. Not long ago, George Bush had indicated he thought a teenage girl should be able to choose what happened to her body, but now the whole party was shifting their stance. The party as a whole now began branding themselves as the anti-abortion party, the anti-feminist party. Pat Robertson, an evangelical minister turned Republican politician and strategist, had described feminism as a socialist, anti-family political movement that encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. Even within this cultural backdrop, the normie press was unable to grasp why young women would be angry. And their treatment in the press led the Riot Grrrls to put a moratorium on speaking with the press at all. They didn't know how to win in this fight to be seen for what they actually were. But all of this press had led to more and more people wanting to get involved in Riot Grrrl. A lot of these people's ideas of Riot Grrrl were formed by what they've read in the press, which isn't to say the newbies wouldn't have understood the underlying purpose of Riot Grrrl, but for some it really was just a new cool thing, a new fad to jump on. And the fairly small Olympia and DC scenes really weren't equipped to guide a nationwide movement, or a movement that moved beyond the scope of the nation. Instead of just being members of punk communities they helped to build, now Bratmobile and Bikini Kill were spokespersons for a movement. They were now put up on pedestals, or they were vilified for no longer being punk enough. And Bratmobile famously broke up on stage one night when everything went absolutely wrong. Right before Bratmobile's set, there had been a fight at the merch stand, and instead of kicking out the guy involved in the incident who had been climbing on tables and saying inappropriate things, someone kicked out one of the women who were actually running the merch table. So the other woman from the merch table, Cindy, went up to the stage and asked to say something. She started trying to explain what had happened, explain the issue, perhaps not very effectively since she was accusing Bratmobile of not providing a safe space for women. But Allison Wolfe let her say her piece, and Cindy kept getting on the mic between songs. The audience was hearing more from Cindy than from the band. Joan Jett came up on stage and started telling Allison she needed to do something and stop letting Cindy talk. Allison ended up crying on stage. Then Molly Newman tossed down her drumsticks and said she quit the band, storming off stage. Aaron Smith, their guitarist, got on the mic and told Allison she was not going to play with her anymore, and she also left the stage. This sounds like a literal nightmare. Public embarrassment, your friends turning on you, a celebrity randomly showing up out of nowhere. It was the end of Bratmobile's first run. This moment shows the scene's desire to empower the women in the scene, but it also shows how the best of intentions can still lead to disorganized chaos. And the Riot Grrrl scene was spreading faster than the centers of the scene could handle. They couldn't afford to print enough zines for the requests coming from around the country. They could issue a moratorium on speaking with the press, but they couldn't actually control the little Riot Grrrl groups around the whole country and abroad. Because by this point, Riot Grrrl had spread outside of the country too. Huggy Bear was a Riot Grrrl band from Brighton, England. They received some coverage in the press, and they were spreading the DIY spirit at a time when, according to the band, indie had become more of a musical genre and less of an actual subculture in the UK. Their track, Her Jazz, is another of the iconic tracks of early Riot Grrrl, proclaiming themselves boy-girl revolutionaries, and declaring this is happening without your permission. The UK scene boasted some other bands like Skinned Teen, Linus, Girl Frenzy, and Mambo Taxi, who made one album before two of the band's members went on to create Voodoo Queens. According to the press, Riot Grrrl was over just a couple years after it started getting media attention. This is the way the press treats every subculture, commodifying it briefly, and then moving on to something it can at least pretend is new. The phrase girl power was born in a feminist punk zine and became the slogan for a manufactured British pop band called the Spice Girls over a span of just 4 years. Artists like Liz Phair, and even more prominently Alanis Morissette, were able to reach the charts with a less jagged little pill than what the Riot Grrrls had been offering. And a major label ska band hit the charts with Just a Girl, a song raging about the injustices of being a girl, without calling out anything in particular. Gwen Stefani's often exposed tummy wasn't marred by any confrontational magic marker, and the Riot Grrrl scene's momentary blip on the public's consciousness was eclipsed by artists who could adopt some of the attitude without making anyone actually uncomfortable. But whatever the press was saying, the underground was doing what it does. The real artists kept going. Even after Bratmobile, Heavens to Betsy, and then Bikini Kill all dissolved, Ladyfest carried on some of the same missions of those Riot Grrrl events. Some of the ex-Riot Grrrls focused energy on making girls' music camps, where girls were encouraged to learn instruments and see themselves as creative forces. Girls Rock was another of these established in 2016. These movements have continued to the present, with amazing feminist artists taking up the same causes between then and now. From Beth Ditto and her band Gossip, to Peaches, Pussy Riot, and of course, Sleater-Kinney. So that was Riot Grrrl. But what is Riot Grrrl? Is it still here? Is it still relevant? There are quite a few modern bands taking up the Riot Grrrl mantle, and I was curious to speak with some of them and find out why this movement is happening. Why now? And why call it Riot Grrrl so long after the original movement happened? So for the next part of the video, we're going to hear from a few Riot Grrrls, and one member of a queercore band, to give some first-hand insight into some of the things I really wanted to find out more about for this new scene. First, how are people getting into this scene? And why is it so relevant right now?
I think the spirit was always there, especially because, Trump got elected in 2016. It was really scary for a lot of people.
The 2010s, 2015, 2016, 2017, that was another wave of feminism to me. Beyonce had a whole performance with the word feminist in the background. The words body positivity were a thing.
But yeah, then I graduated and it was freaking COVID, and I had been academically studying jazz really intensely. I started writing in my bedroom again, writing with my acoustic guitar again.
It feels very weird because there's a lot of random pop culture stuff that mentioned Riot Grrrl that came out during COVID. And then we were all also learning about the old movement simultaneously. I think a lot of people rediscovered Riot Grrrl through TikTok.
I was on this Tumblr page and I just saw the words Riot Grrrl, feminist, in glittery gifts. I'm what's that? What does that mean? Why is there 3 R's? I had already been identifying as a feminist, so it was an easy transition to feel represented in the Riot Grrrl.
All of us kind of started learning about it at that time or rediscovering it, that's when some of the first bands started to happen.
I didn't start playing music with the intent of like, okay, like I'm a Riot Grrrl now, right? Like my songs were like my experiences, but which were often like, you know, influenced by race, class, gender, whatever. And so it felt like Cecil from Cat Crash, I think, was like actually the first person to like label Lychee and like be like, you're a Riot Grrrl now, like you're playing Riot Grrrl's Not Dead.
Riot Grrrl is back. Like, we've been having these feelings of it's coming, and we were all doing it separately. Like, that's what it all felt like. We were all individually learning and wanting to do this separately. And then within the past year, it's like we all came together.
Purely because this video is already too fucking long, I'm not diving deep into queercore here. But we're going to hear from Luciyan on how he found the queercore scene, and a little about its history.
I think it was a very diverse, broad group of people that had enough at about the same time and started making music to get their points across. Part of it came about as a protest towards the transphobia that was present in first wave Riot Grrrl. As far as I have read, trans women were very much excluded from the very first wave of Riot Grrrl. The next sort of wave has morphed into this Riot Grrrl, queercore amalgamation where you either speak up for everyone or you get out. It is unfortunate that a lot of us have so much in common in the ways that we are affected by such a deeply racist, misogynistic and patriarchal society. However, it's great to see people actually come together and form a movement. The genre itself is so broad and diverse, and that is wonderful. I think a lot of it is to do with writing about queer issues, speaking about queer issues, speaking about what we're experiencing, what we have experienced, and what we will experience if no one listens to us. Most of the queer bands seem to, we kind of find each other and, you guys want to play gigs with us? Yeah, let's play some gigs together, and you form these little communities and make friends with all these other bands, and it's absolutely lovely. When I stumbled across it, it was like, yes, this is a rebellion that I can get behind. You know, this is actually people like me trying to do something for us, and it's through a medium that I love. So I get to make art and love making art, and also say my piece. Sorry, that was my bird.
Queercore shares a lot of the same DNA as Riot Grrrl, as Luciyan mentions here. From the earlier era of queercore, I recommend Tribe 8, one of the originators of the scene. They have very in-your-face lyrics dealing with lesbian life, culture, and sex. S&M. I mean, their most well-known album is called Fist City, so that gives you an idea what you're getting into. Then there's Team Dresch. Also from Olympia, they had friends and collaborators from the Riot Grrrl scene, but Donna Dresch's own band's music focuses on queer experiences, especially on their second album, Captain My Captain. Musically, Dresch's vocals are emotive in a way that reminds me of Midwest emo, and musically there's more melody, not quite pop punk, but it's definitely not hardcore. This isn't a queercore video, but if you want to start exploring that rabbit hole, that'll give you a starting point for doing so. I also wanted to get some insights from current Riot Grrrls on the problems within the first wave of Riot Grrrl, and also on the perceived issues with the term itself. Is the term Riot Grrrl not inclusive enough? And should the current movement still be called Riot Grrrl?
It was a predominantly white female space, and you know, this started Sister Girl Riot, Sister Girl Riot, which was like person of color kind of subset of Riot Grrrl, because they weren't carving out a space for them in the original movement. They had to go on and make an offshoot, which was unfair of the original movement to not include people of color. Kathleen Hanna has spoken a lot about how she actually wants the movement to die and for us to start a new movement, and doesn't want the name to continue. And I think that's hard because there's such a great foundation built, and yes, there are issues in it, and I think addressing those issues is incredibly important, but also just moving past them. If there's a great foundation built, there's no reason to build on top of that and make it stronger and better.
It's a fine line between excluding trans women, non-binary people, femmes, and discrediting AFAB women that were there with the term. So if you desex it, so you're not using the word girl at all, then that is dismissing all of these women and all of their work that they've done. but if you keep it bioessentialist, it's you got to find the middle ground.
We don't know what to call ourselves. So we use Riot Grrrl because that is the name, and you know exactly what you're talking about. Like if you're having a conversation with someone that has some subculture knowledge, they're going to know what you're speaking about. We've had these conversations, a lot of the current Riot Grrrls in the scene. We don't know what the new term is. There's nothing that's really being proposed except for Riot Grrrl. But then again, those are just used interchangeably. That's just if you feel uncomfortable with the girl part, if that doesn't feel like that aligns with you. Maybe someone will come along that is like the new leader of this movement that has that term.
So if you're wanting to explore modern Riot Grrrl and queercore, who else should you check out?
We have Burly Girlies from Vermont. We have Cat Crash from Connecticut, now New York. They were originally Connecticut.
Definitely Cat Crash. I mean, they to me are like leading the charge. I really like Cecil's writing. Like the songs are catchy and like smart. Macintosh and DC are doing a lot of really cool work.
Tab Girl, New Jersey, now New York. Evie Echoes and the Locations, New York. Macintosh, Washington, DC. Lady Lychee, New York. Brea Fournier and the Dream Ballet, New York. Froggy is Philly. VIAL is Minneapolis, I think. Pathetica, New Jersey. Death Pill, Ukraine. The Menstrual, Cramps. Showgirls, Connecticut. The Pheremones is Florida.
I would say listen to Dazey and the Scouts. That album is incredible. I was listening to it earlier, actually. I'm so upset that they didn't make more music. I adore that band. I love
that
the music.
one album.
Sweet 16, incredible song. It was the first like actual lyrical gut punch, I think. That album is so fundamental to the queercore movement as it is now. Most of the time you say Dazey and the Scouts in a venue at a queer gig and everyone will perk in here.
Violent Vickie is Florida and American Girlfriend is New Jersey. And those are just some of the ones that I thought of the top of my head. Cat Crash does this really wonderful thing. They do these Riot Grrrls Not Dead festivals, and they've been doing it in different spots of the country. And so it's only growing. I feel like there's a new Riot Grrrl band every couple weeks, and it's beautiful.
I love Mommy Longlegs, who are now defunct, but were ridiculously catchy and fun. I recommend the Assholes and Life Rips EPs to start. Dazey and the Scouts is not just a favorite of Luciyan's, they're also a favorite of mine. And then a few more shoutouts from me: Lambrini Girls, Big Joanie, Petrol Girls, 18 Fevers, Pleasure Venom, Dreamwife, HotWax. And for something more post-punk Riot Grrrl, check out Male. And if you want to actually hear some of my favorite tracks from these artists, check out the playlist in the description, which you can find on either YouTube or Apple Music. Okay, so in the comments for the last video, several people mentioned wanting a reading list for those who wanted to go a little deeper into this. And if you've watched this much of the video, maybe you're also curious to go deeper. So here are the main books that I used when I was developing this two-part series. First, Women Make Noise. This has a lot of insightful looks at different eras and music scenes. This book is what inspired me to start the last video with the girl groups of the 60s. And it also put some of the lesser known artists mentioned in the last one on my radar, some of the smaller bands. So yeah, highly recommended Women Make Noise. This is a fairly recent, but not super recent compilation. Then we've got Shouting Out Loud. This is a really good book on the story of the Raincoats. This is still pretty new. I don't know if it's in paperback yet, but if you're a fan of the Raincoats, there is pure gold in this book, covering everything from their original run. And it also looks at their reunions they've done and everything that they've done in the time since. It also explores a lot of what caused them to get popular again in the late 80s and early 90s that I discussed in the last video. So a fascinating book if you're a fan. Then if you're looking specifically for Riot Grrrl, there's Girls to the Front by Sarah Marcus. And this goes through the story of the Riot Grrrl scene, showing how it came together and also going over the events that led to it dissolving. I do wish this one went more in depth, specifically with bands, albums, and the music side of things, but it's more focused on the scene, the people, the community, and the culture. Still excellent read. Oh yeah. That one too. Then we've got Kathleen Hanna's Rebel Girl. This is a fascinating read. It gives you insight into how this pivotal figure, one of the central figures of the scene, how she feels about that era looking back and what it was like for her, but all of the trigger warnings for this book. Maybe the movement will change. Maybe it'll adapt and adopt a new name. Or maybe it won't. Whatever you want to call it, there's a new wave of feminist punk. They're creating community, putting together benefits, and organizing to try and make things a little bit better for people. And they're also making kick-ass music along the way. So if you're a modern Riot Grrrl, leave a comment about your band or your zine or whatever your project is. If you don't know about it already, I have a radio show I post on Mixcloud, and the prom night episode is focused on Riot Grrrl and some of the adjacent artists. So I've made a whole lot of related stuff you can check out if you're so inclined. And if you're still here in what I'm guessing is my longest episode yet, thanks for your attention span. Thanks to Nico from Bad Static, thanks to Luciyan from Creeping Embers, thanks Emma from Lady Lychee, and thanks to Ebony Watts from the Zine Scene. Thanks for watching Eclecticism, and I will see you next time. That drinking game was a terrible idea.